In this next section of the cardiovascular system, we're going to talk about the cardiac conduction system, the cardiac cycle, and cardiac output. The heart is composed of cardiac muscle, or myocardium, and because the heart is composed of a muscle, it has the ability to contract when stimulated by an electrical impulse. Cardiac muscle also has the ability to conduct or transmit an electrical impulse. The cardiac conduction system of the heart is a system in which an action potential is created and transmitted, and in turn, that action potential stimulates the contraction of the atrium and ventricles. So in the animation, you can see an electrical impulse being created and then being transmitted throughout the heart. Not only is the heart composed of myocardium, or cardiac muscle, it's also composed of nodal tissue. Nodal tissue is unique because it has properties of both muscle and nervous tissue. The first type of nodal tissue is called the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node is also known as the pacemaker cells. It's a cluster of cells located in the right atrium that has the ability to spontaneously generate an electrical impulse, which in essence sets the heart rate of the heart. The next nodal tissue is the atrioventricular node. The atrioventricular node is also located in the right atrium. After the atrioventricular node comes the atrioventricular bundle, or the bundle of His. The atrioventricular bundle will branch into a right and left bundle branches. The atrioventricular bundle, along with the right and left bundle branches, will travel through the interventricular septum and up the walls of the left and right ventricles. And finally, the right and left bundle branches will create smaller little branches called Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers extend up into papillary muscles and aid in the closing of atrioventricular valves. So in the animation here of the cardiac conduction system, you can see that electrical impulse starts at the sinoatrial node, and that electrical impulse will travel through the atrial walls, causing the atrial walls to contract. That electrical signal in the atrial walls then is collected at the atrioventricular node, and from the atrioventricular node, that electrical impulse will travel through the atrioventricular bundle before branching off into the right and left bundle branches. The movement of the electrical impulse through the interventricular septum and up the walls of the right and left ventricles causes the ventricles to contract. Because cardiac muscle can conduct and transmit an electrical impulse, we can measure that electrical activity and view that electrical activity through something called an electrocardiogram. An electrocardiogram records the electrical activity of the myocardium during a cardiac cycle. An electrocardiogram, such as the one viewed here, can be broken up into different waves and complexes. The first wave is what we call a P wave. The P wave represents the depolarization of the atria, and during depolarization of the atria are contracting. The next part of an EKG is called the QRS complex. The QRS complex represents the depolarization of the ventricles, and during the depolarization of the ventricles are contracting. And finally, the last part of an EKG is called the T wave. The T wave represents the repolarization of the ventricles, and during repolarization of the ventricles are relaxing.
The heart's conduction system controls the generation and propagation of electrical signals, or action potentials, that cause the heart's muscles to contract and the heart to pump blood. This electrical activity can be measured at electrodes placed at specific points on the skin, from which a composite recording is produced in the form of a graph. This recording is known as an electrocardiogram, or ECG, sometimes referred to as an EKG. A tracing of the overall electrical activity of the heart, resulting from the propagation of many action potentials. Let's look at what happens during a single beat of the heart and how these events are depicted on an ECG. In a normal heart, Each beat begins in the right atrium with an action potential signal from the sinoatrial or SA node, the heart's natural pacemaker. The signal spreads across both atria, causing the muscle cells to depolarize and contract, inducing a phase known as atrial systole. On the ECG, this atrial depolarization is represented by the P wave. The period of conduction that follows atrial systole and precedes the contraction of the ventricles is depicted on the ECG by the PR segment, a flat line following the P wave. When the signal leaves the atria, it enters the ventricles via the atrioventricular or AV node, located in the interatrial septum. It enters the bundle of His and spreads through the bundle branches and the large diameter Purkinje fibers along the ventricle walls. As the signal spreads through the ventricles, the contractile fibers depolarize and contract very rapidly, inducing ventricular systole. The ECG's QRS complex represents this rapid ventricular depolarization. Atrial repolarization also occurs at this time, but any atrial activity is hidden on the ECG by the QRS complex. Finally, as the signal passes out of the ventricles, the ventricular walls start to relax and recover, a state described as ventricular diastole. The dome-shaped T wave on the ECG marks this ventricular repolarization. On the ECG, the ST segment depicts the period when the ventricles are depolarized. The QT interval represents the time it takes for both depolarization and repolarization of the ventricles to occur. The sequence of events just described and the associated ECG trace repeats with every heartbeat. Remember, an ECG is not a tracing of a single action potential, but an amalgamation of the many action potentials that constitute the electrical activity of the heart.
Next, we'll discuss the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle are all of the events that occur in a single heartbeat, and the events that occur in a single heartbeat are the alternating contractions and relaxations of the heart. Contractions of the myocardium is what we call systole, and during systole, the myocardium of the chambers contract, causing the chambers to squeeze blood out. Relaxation of the myocardium is what we call diastole, and during diastole, the myocardium of the chambers relax, allowing the chambers to fill with blood. There are three phases of the cardiac cycle. The first phase is called atrial systole. During atrial systole, the atria contract, forcing blood into the ventricles. The second phase of the cardiac cycle is called ventricular systole, and during ventricular systole, the ventricles contract, forcing blood either into the pulmonary trunk or into the aorta. And finally, the last phase of the cardiac cycle is atrial and ventricular diastole. During atrial and ventricular diastole, both chambers, atria and ventricles, relax, allowing blood to passively fill each chamber. Heart sounds are due to the heart valves closing, and there are two types of heart valves. One heart valve is called the atrioventricular valve. It's the valves found between the atria and the ventricles. And the other set of valves are what we call semilunar valves, which are found between ventricles and either the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. The first heart sound that you hear is due to the atrioventricular valves closing. We call this lub. And the second heart sound is due to the semilunar valves closing. We call this dup. So when you hold a stethoscope up to your heart and you're listening to your heartbeat, you're actually hearing lub dup, lub dup, lub dup, lub dup. And this is all due to the cusps of the valves slapping against one another while they're closing. And the last topic of discussion for this lecture is cardiac output. Cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped out of a ventricle in 1 minute. Cardiac output is dependent on two factors. The first factor is what we call heart rate, or the beats per minute. The second factor is what we call stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped by a ventricle each contraction. To determine the cardiac output of a heart, you simply have to multiply the heart rate times the stroke volume.